if we are done with this part, then we can move to the next part of the presentation by the Reserve Bank. Over to you, Governor.
Thank you very much, Chair. We're moving on to the second part of our presentation, which is the SAP's findings on the Phala Phala investigation. Just by way of background, the allegations against the president were that he received and kept at his premises, without declaring to the relevant authorities, foreign currency in the form of United States dollars. The investigation in this matter was premised on the allegations by Mr. Fraser that on 9 February 2020, there was a housebreaking incident at the president's main house at the Phala Phala farm, and that the foreign currency in question was stolen. The SAP conducted an investigation into the matter through our financial surveillance department. The financial surveillance department's investigation deals only with the alleged contravention of Exchange Control Regulation 6.1 in respect of foreign currency allegedly stolen from the president's residence at the Phala Phala farm on the 9th of February 2020. Regulation 6.1 is the applicable exchange control regulation in relation to the declaration of foreign currency within 30 days after becoming so entitled to an authorized dealer and or financial surveillance department. Therefore, the scope and purpose of the financial surveillance investigation and the final report are limited to whether there were exchange control violations. Other matters and whether they may relate to the breach of any other law or otherwise are matters which are to be addressed by the relevant authorities and or regulatory bodies and not the South African Reserve Bank. Regulation 6.1 provides that every person resident in the Republic who becomes entitled to sell or to procure the sale of any foreign currency shall within 30 days after becoming so entitled make or cause to be made a declaration in writing of such foreign currency to the Treasury or to an authorized dealer. The exchange control regulations generally do not apply to non-residents of the Republic. Currency, including foreign currency, physically introduced into the Republic is dealt with in terms of the customs and exercise legislation and by the South African Revenue Services. So, any cash that crosses our border at the point of entry has to be declared to SARS. It is a customs matter, not an exchange control matter. There is a declaration form that must be filled at the point of entry, and that declaration is made to SARS, not to SAB. The mere possession of foreign currency is not what is regulated in terms of the foreign exchange control regulations. Between June and September 2022, the Financial Surveillance Department engaged with the President's attorneys and received an initial affidavit and supplementary affidavit from the president, and additional information from the president's legal team, and further affidavits and statements were also received, including an affidavit by Mr. von Wellach, the general manager of Ntabanyoni Estates Close Cooperation, which trades as Phala Phala Wildlife, and is also referred to as Phala Phala Farm. A signed statement by Mr. Hasim, the buyer, and a sworn statement by Mr. Ndlovu, the acting lodge manager of Phala Phala Farm. As at the end of September 2022, the position based on the information obtained by the Financial Surveillance Department can be summarized as follows. During 2019, the president and Mr. van Wellach had a discussion and decided that certain lower quality buffaloes located in Camp 6 on the Phala Phala farm ought to be sold. On the 25th of December 2019, Mr. Hasim arrived at the Phala Phala farm, and on Mr. Hasim's version, he identified 20 buffaloes that he was happy with. Mr. Ndlovu advised him that the price per buffalo was 400,000 rands. Mr. Hasim considered the amount to be reasonable, and in order to secure the 20 buffaloes that he was interested in, he gave $580,000 to Mr. Ndlovu. On Mr. Hasim's version, he gave the $580,000 as security deposit. It would be used as payment for the buffaloes only once he had secured, and buyers relate that information to Phala Phala Wildlife. According to the president and Mr. Ndlovu, the purchase could not be finalized until the necessary approvals were obtained and further processes were undertaken. Mr. Ndlovu provided Mr. Hasim with a note to record the fact that he had received the $580,000 in cash from him. Mr. Ndlovu stored the funds in the safe of the Phala Phala farm and informed the president on 26 December 2019 of what had transpired the previous day. The president advised Mr. Ndlovu that the money could only be dealt with upon his return to the Phala Phala farm, when he would, quote, have the transaction discussed and processed with Mr. von Wellach, close quote. On or about the 30th of December 2019, Mr. Ndlovu decided to move the foreign currency from the safe, to which many employees had access and which was used for general storage purposes at Phala Phala farm, to a bedroom in the president's house in the Phala Phala farm, which he considered to be a safer place, and hid it under the cushions of a sofa for fear of same being stolen while he would be on leave. On 10th February 2020, it was discovered that the president's house had been broken into and the foreign currency stolen. Based on the information, documentation, and evidence received and considered at the end of September 2022, FinServ determined that further information, evidence, and investigation would be required in order to conclude the investigation into this matter, and in particular, whether the agreement for the sale of 20 buffaloes was concluded on the 25th December 2019, but the obligations to pay and deliver the buffalo were subject to conditions of whether the conclusion of the agreement itself was subject to conditions. With regard to the pertinent issue of the nature of the agreement concluded with Mr. Hasim, FinServ were advised inter alia that Mr. Hasim and Mr. Ndlovu did not conclude an agreement for the sale of the buffalo on the 25th of December 2019. That is because Mr. Ndlovu needed to obtain approval on the correctness of the pricing for each buffalo from Mr. van Velach. Mr. Hasim paid the money to Mr. Ndlovu to secure the buffaloes, but on the understanding that the agreement was subject to the following conditions. One, that the final total price had to be confirmed, and that several administrative steps needed to be successfully completed in order to arrange for export and delivery. The outcome of this process was in itself subject to various tests and veterinary procedures that had to be undertaken. These include notifying the state vet about the buffaloes that are intended to be sold so that they can be tested. The state vet will ensure that the negative test results and start the application process to move the buffaloes to the final destination. Phala Phala Wildlife will apply for a transportation permit at the Department of Agriculture. Once the final transportation permit is received from the Department of Agriculture, arrangements for the transportation of the buffaloes can commence. This whole process, we told, can take between 3 to 18 months, depending on the destination. Early in 2023, and after having considered the responses received, the Financial Surveillance Department proceeded to conduct interviews with, firstly, Mr. van Velach on the 14th of February 2023, Mr. Ndlovu on the 21st of February 2023, a further interview with Mr. van Velach on the 11th of April 2023, the President on the 28th of March 2023, and Ms. Msika on the 11th of April 2023. What is clear, both from the information and evidence gathered from the President, Mr. Ndlovu and Mr. van Velach on the one hand, and the evidence of Mr. Hasim on the other, is that there were conditions precedent attached to the transaction. Based on its mandate, the Financial Surveillance Department focused its consideration with regard to the versions on the question of whether a right to foreign currency had accrued to Ntabanyoni estates, which entitled it to sell or procure the sale of foreign currency within the meaning of Exchange Control Regulation 6.1. Financial Surveillance Department identified core evidence which remained undisturbed and signaled that Ntabanyoni estates, on the available evidence, did not become entitled to the foreign currency that it received from Mr. Hasim. The core evidence was as follows. Mr. Hasim left money at Phala Phala farm as a security deposit to secure the buffaloes. Mr. Ndlovu's evidence that he received foreign currency from Mr. Hasim and gave him, Mr. Hasim, a written note, a handwritten note, to confirm that he received US dollars from him for the purchase of buffaloes. Mr. Ndlovu confirmed that the purchase of the buffalo could not be finalized because he still needed to obtain approval, and thereafter further processes would be undertaken, such as calling the state vet, checking whether the arrivals were in good health, the animals were in good health, and obtaining the necessary permits to move the animals. The president's account of events was that there could not have been a binding contract of sale until the animals were examined by the necessary state vet and certain matters were complied with, including the completion testing. That account seemed consistent with the description by Mr. van Vellach of standard industry practice. On the basis of the core evidence and having regard to the SAP's narrow mandate in relation to this matter, it appears that, one, both the buyer, Mr. Hasim, and the seller, Ntabanyoni Estate, intended that certain conditions precedent be fulfilled before there was a finalized sale of buffalo. Two, at the time of the encounter with Mr. Ndlovu, Mr. Hasim told Mr. Ndlovu that he was leaving the money to demonstrate that he was serious about the sale. Three, the foreign currency was stolen before the conditions precedent to the sale could be fulfilled. What were the findings of FinSAP? FinSAP's investigation and approach is not premised on the unquestioning acceptance of the versions placed before the investigators, and that all the truth has been told. It is premised on the need to reach conclusions on the relevant facts before FinSAP and to restrict the investigation to the scope and purpose set out in relation to the mandate of the Financial Surveillance Department. The applicability of Exchange Control Regulation 6.1 in this particular matter would depend on whether there existed an unconditional contract for the purchase and sale of buffaloes. Lawyers call this a perfected transaction. It follows that there was such, if it follows that there was such an unconditional contract, an entitlement to the foreign currency on the part of Ntabanyoni Estate would exist, triggering the obligation under Exchange Control Regulation 6.1 for Ntabanyoni Estate to make or cause to be made within 30 days a declaration in writing of such foreign currency to FinSAP or to an authorized dealer. Conversely, if there was no perfected transaction, there would not be a legal entitlement by Ntabanyoni Estate to the foreign currency, and therefore Exchange Regulation 6.1 would not apply. Based on the information available to financial surveillance, as well as that the sale was subject to conditions precedent, Financial Surveillance Department is of the considered view that the transaction was not a perfected transaction, which gave rise to the legal entitlement by Ntabanyoni to the foreign currency. It appears from the facts available to FinSAP as it related to exchange control, and which have not been contradicted by any other evidence which is available to FinSAP, that the obligation under Exchange Control Regulation 6.1 was not triggered on the part of Ntabanyoni Estates upon receipt of the foreign currency from Mr. Asili, a non-resident of the Republic. In the circumstances, there would not be a breach of Exchange Control Regulation 6.1 by Ntabanyoni Estates. Accordingly, FinServ and the South African Reserve Bank, on the facts available to it, cannot conclude that there was a contravention of Exchange Control Regulation 6.1 by either Ntabanyoni Estates or the president for that matter. Let me turn, Chair, because there had been an interest in the actual final report of financial surveillance, and to refer the committee to Section 33 of the South African Reserve Bank Act. In relation to the report, the South African Reserve Bank is constrained by requirements of Section 33 of the South African Reserve Bank Act, which prevents disclosure of, amongst others, any information relating to the affairs of the SARB or any information acquired by directors, officers, or employees of the SARB in the course of his or her participation in the affairs of the SARB. The transgression of the restrictions of the Section 33 is a criminal offense. So if you are asking me to avail the report, you are asking me to commit a criminal offense, which I am not prepared to do. The aforesaid restrictions apply unless disclosure is required before a court of law or under any other law. Let me say, Mr. Chair, Honorable Chair, that over the past 10 years, we had an investigation of just over 6,000 transgressions of the Exchange Control Regulations. In none of all of those cases have we had to release the report, neither did we even have to pronounce whether the regulations have been broken or not. Because this committee last year asked us to come back to it and say whether there had been a transgression or not, that is why we are here to do this presentation. So, Chair, this is where I leave it.